There you go.
Great. Okay. Well, again, welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for this evening. So first we have Dr. Jesús Sanjurjo, who is currently lecturer in Hispanic and Latin American Studies at the University of Cardiff, but moving soon to Cambridge, where he will be a fellow of the Leverhulme and Newton Trusts. And we're here to discuss his new exciting book, In the Blood of Our Brothers, Abolitionism and the End of the Slave Trade in Spain's Atlantic Empire, 1800 to 1870, published this year by the University of Alabama Press. And we're also very lucky to have with us Dr. Gregorio Alonso, who is an associate professor in Hispanic history at the University of Leeds, and will be offering some comments and asking some questions. Okay, I think I'll stop there and hand over to Jesús.
Thank you very much. Well, I would like to start by thanking Thomas and Paula for the very kind invitation. This is the first time I'm presenting my book, so please apologies for any mistakes or anything that is still in the making. In the Blood of Our Brothers came about originally as my PhD dissertation, and I've been working since I graduated from the University of Leeds on it for almost 3 years. So it looks a lot like my PhD dissertation, but it's a very different very different final product. I thought I would start with a general introduction to the slave trade and slavery in the Atlantic world, although I see some people in this session that know more about the slave trade than I do. So just perhaps a general introduction to the topic for those who are not familiar with it. Since the 16th century up until the 1870s, 11 million people, more than 11 million people were forcibly removed from their homelands in Africa, particularly in Central and West Africa, and they were forced to a life of slavery in the Americas. The slave trade is the most long-lasting cohesive activity of the Atlantic world, and I think this is a very fundamental point to make. It matters to the way in which we think of the Caribbean, of course, the way we think of the Americas more widely, but it's a foundational, a constitutional element of the Atlantic world itself. The first question perhaps that I need to answer is, why does the abolition of the slave trade, the end of the slave trade in the Spanish Caribbean matter? Because when we look at the percentage of the number of enslaved people who were introduced in the Spanish Americas, the percentage is relatively small compared to the other territories. Of course, you see there the 22% of the British Caribbean and the 46% of Brazil. Spain, only the Spanish territories, and that includes all the Spanish territories in the Americas, only represent 12% of the transatlantic slave trade. So why focusing on the slave trade in the Spanish Caribbean? Well, the reason for that is because the slave trade in the Spanish Caribbean, particularly in Cuba, which becomes the most important colonial space in the Spanish Empire after the independences of the different republics and empire in mainland America, it's incredibly intense during a very short period of time. When we look at the overall sequence of the numbers of people who were introduced in the Spanish Caribbean, particularly Cuba, but Puerto Rico too, we see that the numbers explode in the 19th century. The fundamental reason for this has to do with the almost simultaneous, in historical terms, end of the slave trade in the British colonial space in the Caribbean and the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution puts an end to a very sharp end to the sugar production in the French colony of Saint-Domingue. And it also creates a very important influx of plantation owners, investors who are fleeing the French colony and who find refuge in Cuba. And they are going to be at the very center of the emergence of an economic revolution in the island, which is going to very sharply transform, very quickly transform into what we very generally refer to as a plantation economy. And during the first half of the 19th century, Cuba will become the biggest, the most important sugar producer in the world. At the same time that the demand for sugar in Europe and North America is booming. The demand is absolutely at unprecedented levels. And the other thing that makes the slave trade into the Spanish Caribbean a very unique historical experience, a very unique historical case, is that most of it is illegal trade. As you can see there in that dotted line, that marks the legal abolition of the slave trade. All the men, women, and children, African men, women, and children were introduced after that line. They were introduced illegally against the laws of the Spanish monarchy. And that is very relevant because that is going to create a very unique process of what I refer to in the book, eradication. I needed to find a way of explaining the difference between abolition and eradication, because, and this is something that I would like to explain a little bit in the next slide, but a lot of the vocabulary that we use, the historians use to talk about these historical processes is very much influenced by the Anglo narratives, the narrative of the British Empire and the narrative of the United States. And I found myself needing some other ways of explaining things because that language was not adequate. So before I start talking about abolitionism, I wanted to say two things. The first one is that what I think this book does, and what I think the most important thing that this book does, is that it puts at the center of the history of the end of the slave trade, the process of ending the slave trade in the Spanish Empire, a Spanish political activist. They put at the center the voices of people who fought for and against the abolition of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery. And they consider their role within a process that traditionally had always been centered on what the British and the Americans had done in the region. And I think that this is very important, and this is linked to what I was saying a minute ago. We needed a narrative of the abolition of the slave trade in the Spanish Empire that considered the voices, the actions, the political decisions of Spanish political actors. And the other thing that is very important is that this book does not consider the abolition of the slave trade as inevitable. A lot of the narratives in the Anglo sphere, in both the British and the American traditional narratives, have developed a very teleological narrative and almost a historical description that established that the end of the slave trade first and the end of slavery later was inevitable. It was the natural outcome. And I think it's very important, and this becomes absolutely paramount when looking at the Spanish Empire, that this was not how historical actors perceived the process at all. Even at the very late, late decades of the 1860s, the late years of the 1860s, the idea that the slave trade had to end was not a commonplace, was not something that everyone shared in the Atlantic world. And I will say more about that in a minute. And the other important thing that I wanted to highlight before starting with the history of abolitionism is that this book does put Spanish voices at the center of this political process, but it's only part of the story. The other very important part of the story, and there are brilliant colleagues who have been working very hard in recent years to develop those new histories, is the persistent, steady, constant, resistant fight, struggle of enslaved people, Afro-descendants, who from the plantations, from the cities, campaigned, organized, revolted against the institution of slavery and against the slave trade. We cannot understand the history of abolitionism in the Spanish Parliament, in the Spanish Royal Palace, in Havana, in Santiago de Cuba, without considering the fundamental fight of those who were on the ground, fighting against the slave trade and fighting for their own freedom. So this is only part of the story. In 1808, with the invasion of the Napoleonic troops of the Spanish Peninsula, Spain changed forever. The traditional Spanish political institutions collapsed, and we see the emergence of a very unique new institution, a very unique new political arena that is the Cortes of Cádiz. This is the first parliament in the history of Spain, and it is in this political arena where the abolitionist debate is going to emerge for the very first time in the Spanish political context. This is something that I explain in the book. There were, of course, anti-slavery and anti-slave trade positions before Agustín de Argüelles' speech in Parliament in April 1810. But I stress in the book that they only became politically relevant. They were only published, they were only circulated, they only became politically relevant after Argüelles' speech. So I think it's important to establish that it is very difficult to identify any sense of anti-slavery or even abolitionist movement in Spain before 1810. In this date, in April 1810, Agustín de Argüelles, who had become the leader of the liberal faction within the Spanish Cortes, established a secret negotiation with the British authorities, who were very much mediating and advising, controlling the position of the Liberal Party, the Liberal faction in Cádiz. And Argüelles was picked by the British authorities not randomly. Argüelles had been a spy working for the Spanish government in London, and Argüelles had been in the session of the House of Lords that passed the abolition of the slave trade. He knew about the anti-slavery debates. He knew who William Wilberforce was. He admired Wilberforce a lot, and he shares that with the British authorities in Cádiz. So they established an agreement in which, in return of the British government not pushing the Regencia, the Spanish government, to act, they were going to wait for Argüelles to bring that to the Cortes, to bring that to the Spanish Parliament, and to present that as a matter of national pride, as a matter of national dignity, to put an end to the slave trade. And Argüelles, that's something that is very clever in political terms, because he decides to put a double motion to be discussed by the Cortes. And that double motion include the simultaneous abolition of the slave trade and of torture. So by bringing the two together, he obviously establishes a very clear continuity, a very clear connection between the two, but also things that, because most of the parliamentarians in the Cortes were not going to oppose to the abolition of torture, that the chances of not really having a debate about it, just passing the motion easily in the chamber, was going to be the outcome that he expected. He said very famously in that debate that trading in the blood of our brothers is horrendous, atrocious, and inhumane, and the National Congress must not hesitate for a single moment between its high principles and the interest of certain individuals. The reality, however, was that the reaction was immediate. The Cuban deputies, those representing the interest of those very plantation owners who were participating in the slave trade and benefiting from slavery, opposed radically in Parliament. And Arguelles at that point, and he explains this very well to the British authorities, had to prioritize the possibility of passing the constitution, of gathering the support of those very liberal when it came to, for example, economic reforms and political rights, civil liberties for the white population. He prioritized their support, and the discussion on the abolition of the slave trade quietly disappeared first in a constitutional subcommission, and later on in an ad hoc commission that, interestingly enough, is going to be chaired by one of those plantation owners. The second moment in which we see this process that I've generally defined as translating abolitionism, because the influence of the British movement, of the British propaganda, of the British anti-slavery discourses is central to understand this, is the restoration. After the collapse of the courts of Cádiz, the return of Ferdinand VII to power, the British are very clearly from the beginning going to establish that the abolition of the slave trade is a condition sine qua non for reestablishing normal diplomatic relationships between Spain and Britain. And in 1814, Ferdinand VII, who is no abolitionist, he doesn't believe what he's saying here, he signs a memorandum of agreement, a declaration of agreement with the British authorities, with the British government, that says that concurring in the fullness manner in the sentiment of His Britannic Majesty with respect to the injustice and inhumanity of the traffic in slaves, I will take into consideration the means of acting in conformity with those sentiments. I think it's relevant because it is for the first time that a Spanish monarch is going to officially and formally declare himself as an abolitionist, as someone who will walk the path of abolitionism. But as many other promises that Fernando VII proclaimed and said, this was one of the many that he did not fulfill. And he's going to spend his reign, he's going to spend his time in power, opposing the abolition of the slave trade, promoting the slave trade, and protecting the institution of slavery. But what is important is that, and this is something that I explain in greater detail, of course, in the book, is that when we apply the traditional lens of anti-slavery versus pro-slavery, abolitionist, liberal versus absolutist, conservative, to the Spanish political debate, it doesn't work. And here we have an example from the very core of Ferdinand VII's administration, very soon after the Restoration, a moment of brutal repression against liberal ideas. You know, we have hundreds of those very same liberal politicians who have been speaking in Parliament, being imprisoned, being executed, being forced into exile in London, as Gregorio has studied. At that very same time, we have this incredible report by the Council of the Indies of Spain in 1816. There you have the Spanish royal palace, because in 1816 the council returns to Madrid. There are no royal institutions left in Seville. That's too close to Cádiz. Very bad memories for Ferdinand VII. He reestablishes the Council of the Indies together with the Consejo del Reino, are the two most important institutions in advising the policy of the king. And he asked the council for a report. Should I or should I not abolish the slave trade? And the Council of the Indies, formed by those who are ardent defendants of absolutism and the restoration of Ferdinand VII, say, when we consider the question with reference to morality, everyone must admit that the Christian maxims and the mild character of the Spaniards uniting condemning a trade so execrable in itself, and by which a traffic is made in the blood of our fellow creatures. It's a direct reference to the speech of Agustín de Argüelles, and it's impossible that this was an accident. It's absolutely impossible that they had forgotten about what had happened only a few years before, because that was a very important speech. And also, it makes me think, and I present this idea in the book, that this is also part of a negotiation with the British authorities. The idea of the blood of our fellow creatures, the blood of our brothers, that's in William Wilberforce's letters to the people of Yorkshire, is the language of the anti-slavery movement in Britain. And also something that also makes me think that this is pretty much part of an ongoing negotiation with the British authorities is that it took 2 days from the time that this report was approved by the council to the report arriving to London, to the Foreign Office, translated in English. So it's almost absolutely impossible in terms of material time to translate such a lengthy report if it was not almost immediately that the British ambassador had a copy of the report and sent it to London. So it makes me think that this is definitely part of an ongoing negotiation with the British. And Ferdinand VII was not happy. He was outraged by this. And he very clearly says that in his response to the council, and he says that he's not going to take their advice, and they're just going to, again, put the issue to rest. We move forward, and of course, a lot happens in the 20s, a lot happens during the Liberal Triennium, but for the matter of this presentation, I would like to move forward very quickly to a second fundamental moment in the history of the abolitionist, I resist to say movement, the abolitionist position, the abolitionist discourses in Spain. And that is the Cortes of 1836. The return of liberalism to Spain, the reestablishment of liberal institutions in Spain, and the return of Argüelles, now looking a lot older there. After a long exile in London, he was imprisoned in Mallorca and in Ceuta during the first restoration, and he was forced into exile to London during the second restoration after the Liberal Triennium. During this time, he had been in touch with some relevant anti-slavery leaders. He had been exposed to these ideas. There is a lot of work done by Wilberforce and the Anti-Slavery Society in giving the Spanish exiles information, pamphlets, money to inspire them to advocate for the abolitionist cause. And when Agustín de Argüelles returns to Spain, he's elected president of the chamber, the Speaker of the House, equivalent to the Speaker of the House. But he's going to defend very different ideas to the ones that he had defended in Cádiz. He's going to say that the main reason for his change of mind is the development of a more conservative position, or not a conservative position in this new political moment has to do fundamentally with the treason of the American Spaniards because of the independences, and also because of the real fear to lose the very last remaining jewel of the Spanish Empire, which is the colony of Cuba. So in this Cortes, the Spanish parliamentarians will agree to exclude the colonial territories from political representation, and the Cuban deputies are denied entry in the Spanish parliament. And it's as part of that debate that the issue of the slave trade, the issue of the abolition of the slave trade, comes back to the political discussion. And Argüelles doesn't sound like the Argüelles of Cádiz at all. He's forgotten about the blood of our brothers, and he's going to say that there in Cuba, gentlemen, there is a race that believes itself irreconcilable and that aspires to the destruction of the other inhabitants as the only way to obtain its freedoms. Cubans stand atop a volcano. And to support his position, Vicente Sanchez, who is going to be a fundamental figure in advancing the idea of the need of excluding the American deputies from Parliament. If the island of Cuba is not a Spanish, it will be black, necessary black, and everybody knows that. We must protect the whites, our brothers, from the dagger of the Negroes. It is incredible how this message, how this metaphor, how this rhetorical figure of the brothers permeates Spanish political discourses around the issues of slavery for so long and for such different positions. Because here Sancho is advocating for the most radical, racist, white supremacist position, even for the eyes and the ears of the British diplomats. This sounds absolutely outrageous. And the report that follows these debates back to the Foreign Office is a complete disbelief of what had happened with the former liberal figures of Spanish parliamentarism. What is very interesting and kind of like reinforces this message that comes time and time again in my book, that we cannot think of the history of the anti-slavery movement in Spain through the narrative or the traditional lenses of egalitarians versus conservatives, progressive versus conservatives, or anti-slavery versus pro-slavery. It doesn't work that way. And the very best example, sadly, of this is the figure of José Antonio Sacco. José Antonio Sacco is a Cuban intellectual who aspires to represent the rich, emerging, in many ways liberal economic actors in Cuba, and who is going to, for more than 30 years, advocate for the need to stop the slave trade as the best way to whitening the island. The idea of stopping the trade because the Africanization of Cuba is putting its prosperity in danger, and that is paramount, is essential to stop the slave trade to save white Cuba. So he is going to oppose the slave trade. He is going to collaborate with the British anti-slavery movement. He's going to produce some pamphlets and some books in which the British anti-slavery movement is going to collaborate. He's going to even collaborate with some of the very radical abolitionists that are operating on the ground in Havana and in Santiago. But he's going to do that from the most radical white supremacist, racist position imaginable. It is true that the African, in the manner of other savages, knows how to run and jump, and also to beat his fellows and wild beasts. But when the cries of hunger cease and the fury of their passion is extinguished, then they indulge in the deepest and most stupid indolence. I chose one example of his writing that, I thought it was less horrible than others, but his position with regard to the superiority of the white race and the promotion of white supremacist ideology in almost every single piece of writing that he produced is consistent. But there were some dissident voices, and there were some voices from within the Spanish parliament that are going to be the heirs of the message that Agustín de Argüelles had introduced in Cádiz in 1810. And I think that the most remarkable example of this is Domingo Vila. Domingo Vila will later on become Vice Chancellor, the rector of the University of Barcelona. And he's a profoundly radical character, profoundly radical politician, and he represents in those quarters of 1836 the most advanced and progressive vision, a vision of openness, of reconciliation with the colonies, with former colonies, with the now independent republics, a process of reconciliation in between the Spanish people, but also it represents the most advanced ideas when it comes to egalitarianism, equality, and abolitionism. And he says, "In vain are my efforts to rouse any repugnance in myself at the thought that a man of color might sit at my side on these benches. Intelligence also lays under a skin less white than ours." And you have to put this in the context of a debate, of a reply directly addressing the white supremacist position that had been hammered by Argüelles and Vicente Sancho. It is a remarkable speech. It is isolated. It's difficult to establish any connections between Domingo Vila and any wider abolitionist network. I haven't been able to do that. I don't say that it hasn't happened, but at least it doesn't feel like he is part of any bigger organization with regard to the slave trade and with regard to abolitionism. But what he says goes a lot further beyond abolition of the slave trade, abolition of slavery. He's talking about civil rights, and he's talking about the participation of Black people in parliament. And that is something that hasn't happened anywhere in Europe yet. So it's a really remarkable. And I think that people like Domingo Vila should be and must be celebrated in Spanish history. And a lot more work needs to be done to remember the leaders of the anti-racist discourses in Spanish parliamentarism. And what follows is a long, very long process. And I think that one of the most difficult things for the book was that we have these moments that are incredibly rich, in which a lot of things happen, in which we have a lot of publications being made, secret meetings happening, diplomatic negotiations going on, international treaties agreed. But then we have these very long periods of times in which nothing happens. And the level of desperation on the British side is absolutely mad. They threatened to break diplomatic relations with Spain multiple times during the 40s and 50s, because the Spanish are playing, and they play very well, what I define this balancing act game. They are going to use the very real threat of an American invasion, of the possibility of Cuba becoming part of the United States, something that the British, don't even want to talk about, don't even want to consider. They put in one side of the balance that, and on the other side, the need for slavery. This idea that Cuba is everything and Cuba is slavery. Without slavery, Cuba will be nothing. Without slavery, Cuba will be American. And the outcomes, you can imagine them. One possibility for that Cuba not being Spanish will be Cuba will become a second Haiti, a massive slave revolt that would put an end the white sovereignty of the island. The other alternative would be the American invasion, either through proxy, and we see various attempts through piracy, through better or worse connected individuals who are going to attempt an invasion of Cuba, but also the possibility of the Cuban oligarchs, the so-called Saccharocracy, the owners of the plantations, who, if Spain was going to abolish slavery or the slave trade even, they will change sides and proclaim themselves to be part of the American family, of the American Union. And this is something that is a very long process. And I just brought you 3 examples of how this evolved from the 20s to the late 50s. In 1825, very, very early in this process, George Cannon, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, the British Secretary of Foreign Affairs, talks very frankly to the American ambassador, and he says, like, you cannot allow that we should have Cuba. We cannot allow that you should have it. And we can neither of us allow that it should fall in the hands of France. So it's going to remain Spanish, because that is in the interest of the status quo. That is in the interest of everyone. There are some discussions, always very unsuccessful and preliminary, about the possibility of the British purchasing Cuba. Spain also, in one negotiation, indicates the possibility of an exchange for Gibraltar, something that the British say no immediately. And is always at a very like second diplomatic level. It never reaches the top levels of either administration. The second moment is this very unique 1854 Ostende Manifest, a meeting of diplomatic representatives of the United States in Europe, aligned with the southern states, absolutely in favor of the continuity of slavery, of the centrality of slavery to the viability of the Union, who are going to put pen in paper and say this. They didn't intend this manifest to become public, but it would later on be published by the American newspapers. And that's going to create a huge controversy between Spain and the United States. Cuba is as necessary to the North American Republic as any of its present members, and that it belongs naturally to the great family of states, of which the Union is the providential nursery. What matters here, and this is the very important point, and it goes back to the idea that I said at the beginning, that we cannot think of slavery, of the end of slavery, as being inevitable, because for a lot of Cuban people, for a lot of Spanish people, the southern state of the United States represented the example to follow, the ultimate example that a liberal, democratic, advanced, progressive nation was a slavery economy, had at its center slavery as this fundamental economic institution to provide for the prosperity of the Union, for the prosperity of the Republic. So this is the example that they're going to follow. So these very traditional descriptions, particularly British historiographical narratives, that kind of like don't understand the Spanish situation because they don't see how this could keep going on and on and on. Well, the reality is that there is a very important example that they identify as their model. And the model is not Britain. The model is the southern states of the United States. And the position on the Spanish side is, in this process of creating this balancing act strategy, is that slavery and Cuba are the same thing, and Cuba is everything. What is Cuba for Spain? Augusto Conte, first secretary of the Spanish embassy in London, asked himself. Cuba is everything, is what remains of the wreck of our fortune. It is the future of our train and marine. So the situation and this balancing act works perfectly for the Spanish authorities because it keeps the British under control. You know, don't push us too much to abolish the slave trade because we might lose Cuba and that's going to be a disaster for everyone. But it also works very well for the other actors interested in the Atlantic because at the same time, the slave trade is flourishing. The slave trade in the 1850s reaches its maximum to Cuba. And the Cuban economy is absolutely booming. In demographic terms, for the first time in 1848, the Black population represents more than 50% of the overall population in Cuba. So for the first time in the 19th century, the population of Cuba is majority Black. The epilogue, the final process of all this happens in a very unexpected way. And that's the 1860s, particularly from 1865 onwards. I start that chapter saying that in 1865, when the Spanish anti-slavery society, la Sociedad Española Abolicionista, is established, no one thought that slavery, or for that matter, the slave trade, was going to end anytime soon. There were no reason, economic or political, to think that the slave trade was going to end. The constitution, the establishment of anti-slavery, of an anti-slavery movement in Spain is fundamental. It's essential. I think that the traditional historiography have ignored its impact in Spanish politics and have disregarded their contribution to the outcome of the end of the slave trade. And I think that one thing that I do in the final chapter of my book is really provide a study of that very early anti-slavery movement in Spain, that very early manifestations of the anti-slavery society, the abolitionist society in the 1860s. Because a lot of the studies of this very same society focus on a later period, after in the context of the Cuban War for independence. But there was very little that discusses the origins of this society, and that puts it in connection with what's going on in the Atlantic world. A fundamental figure of this movement, and one of my political heroes is Concepción Arenal, who is a politician, an activist, an author, and a poet. And this movement is going to organize and put together some of the biggest crowds at the time. They are going to tour Spain. They are going to organize meetings and events in theaters, and they are going to in many ways replicate what the anti-slavery movement had done in Britain, but they are going to adapt it to the political tone, the political speeches, the political music of the Spanish Empire, of Spain. Horrible slavery, who in righteous anger does not burn, who heartbroken does not groan, and to God and the world cry for their help. Sounds better in Spanish. And finally, the end of the slave trade. And as I say in the book, the end of the slave trade happened because of fundamentally international factors. The victory of the North in the American Civil War, the constant pressure of the British to finally put an end to this, the agreement ultimately between the British and the Americans to not allow Spain to play the game of the balancing act anymore. And what is left for the Spanish politicians is to claim some agency over the process. And crucially, and this is the sad story of the abolition of the slave trade in Spain, of the end of the slave trade in Spain, is to do these, to put an end to the trade with the fundamental goal of protecting slavery. It is possible that the world will still tolerate for some time the existence of slavery within Cuba as a domestic issue. This will be possible as long as it is an isolated issue that concerns only the internal organization of Spanish society. But if we allow it to become an international question, if we allow it to acquire a European character, I assure you one thing that you already know, that the world will not tolerate it. The time has come for the slave trade to disappear. What is interesting is that by the time that Cánovas del Castillo was saying this in Parliament and passing the whatever law against the slave trade, the last one, but the latest one in a long series of laws, the abolition of the slave trade had already happened. The end of the slave trade had already happened. It had been decided abroad. It had been put an end abroad. What is left for Spanish Parliament and for Spanish politicians is to claim some agency. There is going to be some landings, some arrivals of some very late slave trade vessels. The last one that is recorded, not directly by slave voyages, but by other sources, is in 1868. That's the one that I refer to in my book. But as David Murray, who is, for me, the most important scholar who has studied this issue and who's recently died, it is impossible to establish which was the very last one. It's possible that there were some regional trade as well, some enslaved people coming from other ports in the Caribbean at the time. It's very difficult to establish which one was the last one, but we know for certain that between 1866 and 1868, the slave trade in the Spanish Empire and in the whole of the Atlantic world, because Cuba was the last destination of enslaved people in the Americas, was finally put to an end. So thank you very much for listening. If you want, you can scan that QR code that I will take you to a website that we've prepared with some text from the book and also some links if you want to get the book. Thank you so much.
Fantastic, Jesús. Thank you for your presentation. So we'll go over to Gregorio now, who will have some comments and questions.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Jesús, for this wonderful presentation. You say that your main contribution is to put the peninsular politicians at the core of the discussions on Atlantic history, but you also highlighted the deviant ideological career of one of the forerunners, Agustín de Argüelles. Agustín de Argüelles, in fact, was very much involved in convincing members of the Liberal Party when it came to approve the Article 12 in the Cádiz Cortes, in the Cádiz Constitution, the one that declares infamously religious intolerance. But then in 1835, when he published the Examen Histórico de la Reforma Constitucional de las Cortes, he would actually regret it. So in religion, he became slightly more open-minded. Whereas when it comes to slavery and enslaved people, as you rightly pointed out, the journey was literally the opposite.
Yeah.
So he was abolitionist, and then eventually he changed his mind. You also mentioned that he, in his defense, argued about the trial of the insurgents in the 1810s and 1820s. But perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about this question. I mean, how relevant was his stay in London in the 1820s and 1830s in this radical change? Yeah,
it's something that I spent a lot of time researching, and that it was definitely not the most fruitful part of my research, because he lives a very in terms of his writing, a very prolific time in London. He's going to write a lot. He's going to write always in a very bitter tone. He's going to be incredibly sad about what has come out of the two revolutionary process of Cádiz and the Liberal Triennium. And he's going to dedicate a lot of time to reflect on the mistakes that he and his fellow colleagues in Parliament have done, and his relationship or his connections with the people in London, the liberal politicians who are going to welcome the exiles with open arms, as you know very, very well, who are going to, in the case of Argüelles specifically, he's going to be offered a pension by the British government that he's going to reject because he doesn't want to be perceived or accused of being a foreign agent or having done what he had done because he wanted to, collaborate or interfere with the British. So he's going to live a very quiet, a very recluded life in London. He's not going to participate, very much in the tertulias and the social events that are happening in London, in which a lot of these Spanish politicians are going to have a very central place, a very central role. And he's going to become the private librarian, the kind of like a very interesting position as the keeper of the books of Holland House, of Lord Holland. Lord Holland was, of course, an abolitionist. He had himself provided funds for the Anti-Slavery Society. He had collaborated with William Wilberforce. He was passionate about bringing a British liberal parliamentarian system to Spain. But there is no word about slavery or the slave trade. In all the correspondence between Argüelles and Lord Holland, there is no reference to slavery and slave trade. It's almost as if Arguelles, puts the question of slavery and abolitionism in the same bag as all those mistakes that I did in Cadiz, all those, and he says that, not referring specifically to the slave trade, more generally to the relationship with the American territories. He says, like, all those naive ideas that I advanced in the past, we need to stop them, and we need to go back and forget about them because of the treason of the Americans, because of what they have done to the constitutional project.
Okay, thank you. The other comment regards the nature of Spanish abolitionism. You mentioned that it is delayed, that their achievements are not remarkable, but at the same time in your book and in the project, you talk about racist abolitionism. Could you please give us a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, I think it's very central to, and I think it's kind of like one of the key ideas that I try to present in the book is that the most important form of anti-slavery discourses, of an anti-slavery position, public anti-slavery position, for more than 20 years, is the one that is advanced by José Antonio Sacco. And José Antonio Sacco is a racist, white supremacist activist who is going to try to stop the slave trade as a way of stopping the Africanization of Cuba. So his relationship with the anti-slavery agents, that are operating in Cuba, with the anti-slavery society, with the anti-slavery groups in London, it's very strange. And I think it's David Murray who says, like, his collaboration could have never really worked. They were coming from very, very different places. But the fact and the reality is that for the British, he is kind of like an ally in this process. And they are going to a certain extent, work with him because he's the loudest anti-slave trade voice for almost 20 years in Spanish politics. And, kind of like in this possibility that he's, kind of like the British are going to contemplate at some point, like they say, like, well, maybe we might not be able to achieve the end of slavery with him because he's in principle not opposed to that. He's all in favor of property rights, and he's like absolutely happy with people being enslaved as long as, is within a liberal economic system. So they say, well, we might not achieve the abolition of slavery supporting Sacco, but we might get to the first stage of the process, which is the end of the slave trade, because the British are replicating in their heads what it worked in their political tradition. First, the abolition of the slave trade, 1807, later on the abolition of slavery, 1833. But that's not working for Cuba because the reality of the plantation is that the need for a constant influx of new enslaved people requires the two. You cannot have a slavery with a plantation model, with a sugarcane plantation model in Cuba without the slave trade. So that was never going to work. But it's something that the British authorities try for a very long time.
Mm-hmm. So just to finish this and open it to the floor, would you argue that apart from these paradoxical material circumstances that obviously set the background, whitening was more powerful for Sacco and his comrades than any Christian beliefs or liberal credentials then?
That's very interesting. I think that when I started investigating all this, I really thought that, that religion was going to be a lot more important than it ended up being, or at least to the conclusions that I came up. There is religious messages throughout the abolitionist tradition. We see that in the reference of Arguelles does in Parliament. We even see that, of course, from the institutions that are coming from the absolutist institutions, we see that kind of like happening time and time again, the idea of the Christian morals and the idea of Spain being. But what is very interesting is that those same Christian messages, Catholic messages, are going to be used for the exact opposite. A recurrent message that is going to be advanced by the pro-slavery camp is that we cannot compare, there is no need to compare the slavery in Spain with the slavery that it was happening in the British colonies or in the United States, because in the Spanish colonies, the slaves are being treated a lot better than in other colonial spaces, because their masters are Catholic and they know how to treat their enslaved people as their children. They guide them, they nurture them, all this bullshit, right? So that is going to be a recurring theme. So and also, of course, the position of the Vatican is never going to be one as tense as the one of the British Empire, as the one of the British authorities. So I don't really see. And then, of course, the reality that most of these anti-slavery messages are coming from Protestants, and from freethinkers. So the translation into Catholic messages sometimes don't work very well. You have the Bosquejo very early in 1810, which has a very important Christian message. But again, it's coming from a guy who, when he escapes Sevilla, he becomes a Protestant priest. So ends up being like a Presbyterian in Oxford. So, these are not perhaps the most representative of Catholicism, and definitely the Catholic Church and the institutions, the high up ranks of the institutions, and including the Vatican, they are not going to really press on the issue of the slave trade very much on the Spanish government.
Okay, thank you very much. So you were referring to Jose Maria Crespo,
yes.
Blanco
White,
Jose Maria Blanco White. Okay, thank you. And I leave it to the rest of the people. I'm sure you will have many other questions. Cheers.
Thank you, Gregorio.
Thank you, Gregorio. Okay, so yes, we can have a round of questions now, and we have Louis Dean Valencia has his hand up. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I really, really appreciated that, Jesus. And I wanted to first that I think your consideration of race is particularly nuanced, and I appreciate that you call it directly white supremacy, which I think that a lot of other works don't explicitly do. And so I really thought that's an important thing to kind of highlight about your work. And I appreciate how your concept of blood plays out in this discourse of the 19th century. I think that really works well together. And I finished your book a couple of weeks ago, so really enjoyed it. You complicate some of the work of my own late advisor, Christopher Schmidt-Noira, who you cite in the book in really important ways. And I think that the question of inevitability is very important, which I do think that a lot of the historiography, like you've said, kind of goes in that direction. So I'm curious as to how Argüelles' more conservative views compare to perhaps the voices of younger activists. You mentioned Concepción Arenal, both in the book, you have a really nice quote from her, but also in the talk. And I guess I was interested to see sort of how do those political figures who are more radical, we'll say, who are more direct, who are feminists explicitly, how are they taking sort of Argüelles' shift to a more conservative, racist tone?
Yeah, so, the 1860s is this very fascinating moment in Spanish political history, because it really is a turning point in terms of, we see the emergence of these new political traditions that are going to become absolutely central in the first half of the 20th century, but are already there. That's the embryo, right? Like we have, of course, the feminist movement, but we also have the emergence of the working class movement and the very earliest stages of these people who are organizing. And with regard to the question of what to do with Cuba, what to do with the colonies, the labor movement in Spain are going to have a profoundly radical anti-imperialist position, and they are going to be absolutely central. Like, one of the biggest demonstrations, I think it is at the end of the 19th century in my hometown in Gijón, was organized by the anarchists and the communists to a certain, although very small portion of socialists, to oppose the sending more troops to fight the war in Cuba. And these are the same people, the same tradition, who are in the creation of the anti-slavery society, the Sociedad Abolicionista. So yes, so at the end of the 1860s, we see kind of like the traditional the heirs of the tradition of Cádiz that are now they are perceived by these new radical figures as completely outdated. And I think that this idea of Cuba is everything, that cry for what was lost, and that idea of this nostalgia for the times of the Spanish Empire, I think that's going to be an essential element in the construction of conservative messages in the 20th century for the political right in Spain, pretty much up to the civil war, and of course during Francoism, the idea of going back to the good old days of the Spanish Empire is going to be absolutely foundational. And that is already in the Cortes of 1834, is already in Agustín de Argüelles, the idea that, we failed. The constitutional project failed because it allowed the end of the Spanish Empire. But, the good part of that is that we also see the emergence of all these radical voices who are organizing a message. And also something that I didn't say in my presentation, but it's also very important, is that in the constitution of that anti-slavery movement in Spain in the 1860s, the role of Julio Vizcarrondo, a Puerto Rican journalist, very much connected with what is going on in the United States. He's doing a type of journalism that is completely new in Spain, because he's doing American journalism in Madrid in the context of brutal repression against freedom of press, freedom of speech, all that. And he is the first president of the Sociedad Abolicionista Española. So these are the people who are, introducing new ideas, new ways of thinking about the world in Spain.
Tom, do you mind if I just ask a quick question, because I want to follow up on something that Louis mentioned. But I mean, this idea of racist abolitionism, which, I mean, from my superficial reading of the literature on Brazil, is also very present there, right? Let's get rid of slavery so that we can whiten our society. So it seems to be present in a number of slave societies, and clearly also in some ways in the United States, though I don't know that literature that well. But so I guess that just leads me to the question: what's the relative weight then of anti-racist abolitionism, as it were? I mean, you mentioned a few examples, but I mean, is it a very marginal movement within the abolitionist movement? And so would you characterize the abolitionist movement both in Spain, but perhaps, across the sort of transatlantic sphere? Are we talking primarily about a racist abolitionist movement or ideology, or are these even, and how do they play out, these two, if one can characterize it that way? Yeah. Probably not. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I think Manuel left the call because Manuel and I had a lot of discussions about this during my PhD. It's incredibly difficult, I think, the characterization of racism, and to provide a stable definition for the whole of the 19th century. Like, I think that if we use a very strict definition of what it means to be racist, it's going to be very difficult to identify any anti-racist activists in the whole of the 19th century. So I think that it's reasonable to apply a more flexible definition that establishes that if you think that that all men are created equal, or if you think that we all share the same blood, or that slavery is immoral, there is an element of anti-racism in your position, even if it's if it is not at the at the essence of what you are advocating for. There is an element of anti-racism in your position. So I think, and I think that when Agustín de Argüelles says trading in the blood of our brothers, that is an anti-racist vehicle for advocating for the end of the slave trade, because the idea of the brotherhood is something that the British anti-slavery movement had been using very successfully. Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, Olanda Equiano had been using very, very effectively to end the slave trade first and the slavery later. So for me, that's in a certain way anti-racist. But it is true that when we move forward, certain discourses that are not openly anti-racist start to be more racist, because the contribution of fundamentally Black authors in the United States, in Cuba, it's really moving that frontier, is advancing the anti-slavery cause. When anti-racist activists in Cuba start to participate of pro-independence messages, for example, the idea of creating an independent Cuba in which Black people will have political representation, that is a radical anti-racist message. So in the 1840s, what we see, in my opinion, is a reaction to that, and that reaction is brutal. And because even in the Cadiz debates, by the plantation owners, those representing the plantation owners, we don't see the white supremacist discourses that we see in the 30s. So it is, I think that that white supremacist position is a response to the anti-racist messages that are coming from other parts of the Atlantic world. It is interesting, though, that the anti-slavery movement in Spain is so white, and when it comes to Spanish politics, it's very difficult to identify anyone that is not white. When we look at Cuba, however, things look different. And of course, we've got, as I said at the beginning, enslaved people and Afro-descendants fighting for their own freedom. That's the first anti-racist activism, of course. But then we also have mixed-race people, people that don't look white for the Cuban population, who are also producing anti-slavery material and anti-racist material. But yeah, so that's why I think that the association racist, pro-slavery, anti-racist, anti-slavery doesn't really work that well. And I think that's one of the things that in the book I try to show, that we need to abandon those categories, because then what do we do with Sacco? And the risk here, and this is why I kind of so clear and openly in characterizing Sacco as a white supremacist, is because for some of the Cuban historiography, Sacco is a good guy, because he was fighting against the slave trade, and he was also kind of elaborating on the idea of the need for a more independent Cuba. So he's put in kind of the family of the fathers of the nation, or whatever we're going to call them. So one of the things that I wanted to do with the book is to say no, Sacco is a terrible racist who is only doing this because he has a very clear agenda to stop the Africanization of Cuba. Let's not describe him as anything else but as a as a white supremacist leader.
Great, thank you. Tom, and then Bethan.
Hi, thank you, Jesus. Really, really interesting stuff. I really enjoyed this. And two questions. One's a fairly quick one. I just know when you showed the graph of I guess imports of enslaved people, I just noticed that the numbers seem to sort of taper off around the mid 1850s. So could you quickly, and yet in your talk it seemed like the process does go on until the late 1860s. So is that just an issue of reporting data and problems? Just to explain that. The second question is more to do with, I'm interested in this idea of the Southern United States as a model. And I certainly buy the idea that the southern United States were a very important ally. And model seems to me, I wonder, can you explain that a bit more? To what degree could the southern United States really be a model, because it's Protestant, because it doesn't rely on imports of enslaved people, and also because you have very, very positive arguments for slavery there, in the sense that it's the ideal sort of social organization, whereas my sense from your talk is that still most of the pro-slavery arguments were more along the lines of it being a necessary evil. I suppose, to what degree really were they seriously considering the southern United States as a model to be imitated?
Thank you for your questions. So going back to the graph, there is an element of, we relied on the incredibly amazing, fantastic slave voyages, the transatlantic slave trade database. There can be some missing information, and we're constantly contributing. That was one of the most exciting things that I did when I started this research as an MA student. Was the first time that I identify a vessel that was not on the database, and you can go there and submit it and contribute, and you feel so proud of yourself, of making history. So yeah, there is data missing, of course, but I think that overall we can certainly explain the general trends within the graph. So there, in the book I do that. The moments of when the trade stops or when the trade reduces, and I say that cautiously, because even when we look at this point, I don't know if you can, yeah. I mean, even when we look at moments like here or here, we're still looking at pretty relevant numbers when we look at the historical sequence. So yes, is a huge reduction compared to the previous year, the previous 5 years, but still is a very constant influx. And there are 2 moments or 3 moments that I explained well in the book. The first one has to do with there are rumors that the Spanish government is going to enforce the abolition. So the abolition happens here, and there are rumors among planters and slave traders that things are going to end, that the slave trade is going to end. So in the years around the abolition, the trade booms, and then there is a perception, and this is something, I'm not an economic historian, but I relied on what they say, and they say 2 things. One, that this caused a very sharp increase in the prices. So this can be partially explained by how expensive they were, and also because planters and traders bought too many, because they thought that the slave trade was going to end. So they kind of like bought a lot, thinking that there were going to be no more available soon. So they kind of like didn't need that many soon later. This other point is well, to explain that, similar explanation to explain this in terms of like the rises of prices and we don't need any more. This has to do with the agreement, the international agreement of 1835. Again, there is a feeling that the slave trade is going to end, so the planters rush to buy as many as they can. There is also a moment in which the Captain General in Cuba is ardently defending the slave trade and slavery. He even establishes a standard fee of 5 reales, 5 Spanish coins of the time, per slave. That was the bribe. That was the standard bribe that he was going to take from all the slave traders that were introduced in the, and he puts all the resources of the Spanish colonial administration to allow the entry of them. And then what we have is the Escalera conspiracy. This is a very unique episode in the history of colonial Cuba in 1844. The Spanish authorities, they believe that they have identified a massive slave conspiracy, a revolt that is being supported by the British, that is going to erupt any moment. And they start this massive repression against essentially enslaved people and people of African descent, but also to some British citizens. For the first time, we see the arrest of British diplomats in Cuban soil, which creates a lot of controversy, of course, in London and in Madrid. And that kind of like a sharp cut to the sequence, because people are really afraid. Planters are, for the first time, really afraid. They really think that a second Haiti was going to happen, was going to be imminent, and they stop buying very sharply. And then the end of the sequence is, again, the idea of like, okay, the end is near, let's buy more. We also see here the introduction of steamships. So for the first time, steam vessels are going to be used for the introduction of enslaved people. And we see a smaller number of vessels, but with huge cargoes, with huge number of enslaved people on board. So that also explains that rapid sharp, and then kind of like the end of the sequence. And then regarding your second question, remind me a little bit what it was.
Yeah, no, it was just to what degree Spanish politicians and slavers are really considering the United States.
Oh yes, of course, yeah, the United States, yeah.
Just an ally.
Mm-hmm. So maybe I didn't say this correctly in my presentation. The ones who are looking at the United States as a model, fundamentally, the ones who are thinking of the United States as a model are the Cuban saccharocrats, the Cuban oligarchs, the owners of the plantations, and some of the the members of the Cuban societies who are very high up in the colonial administration. Those are the ones who think of the United States as a society that embraces slavery, but that simultaneously has a very attractive package of liberal policies when it comes to political participation and civil rights for that very same people that think of themselves as very important contributors to the prosperity of the empire, and who are white, but who are not benefiting from the political liberties that they think they deserve, because they have been excluded from the Spanish political arena, from the Spanish parliament. So they want the freedom of the American Constitution with the slavery of the southern states. For the Spanish politicians, it's a mixture of admiration and a feeling of threat from the United States. There is an emerging position among the Spanish politicians that think of the United States as the new kind of like an economic miracle, as they envy, for example, how fast they are developing their navy. But also they also feel that it's a real threat, and they are going to talk about them as a real threat. But they do admire things like the expansion of their industry, how big their ports are becoming. We have some Spanish members, some Spanish politicians, some Spanish members of parliament who visit New York for the first time, or who travel to Virginia, and they come back and they talk about the tobacco industry, and they go like, how can we have that tobacco industry in Cuba? How all that was ruined? Look at what is happening there. Tobacco is the new thing. So yeah, it's a mixture of admiration and they're really scared as well of what's going to happen with that.
Great, Bethan.
Hi, Jesús, thank you. I really enjoyed this. I learned a bunch, and I'm super excited to read the book. The first question is, it's kind of like, I don't know anything about this, so please tell me more. And then my next question is a suggestion, because I really want someone to do something. So the first being, and this is a long time ago, is kind of reading from comps and stuff. How does this speak to what's happening in Puerto Rico? I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how much you address it in the book, and if I kind of really remember that most of the stuff that was happening was very much Spain politics. Maybe I'm wrong, because it's like only going back a long time since I've read this stuff. So I'm super interested to know how you kind of build on that, the literature that talks about that.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing was that I think this question about, you know, abolitionists being racist is a super important one. And I think I'm kind of desperate for someone to do this like as a collective project to get the boundaries of empire and language. I mean, my colleague Jose Lingana-Fafe is doing his next book is on kind of Wilberforce and his kind of back to Africana kind of project. So I think there's a lot to be said about these people that are so very much remembered in this celebratory way, and it needs to be done for a popular audience, because I feel all the time I'm arguing with my students and they don't believe me. I would just, this is that, yeah, please do it, it would be wonderful.
So about Puerto Rico, we need definitely more research on Puerto Rico, and I think that a lot more needs to be done to understand the local dynamics, the colonial dynamics of the island. I say two important things about Puerto Rico in the book. The first one is that because we don't see the development of the plantation economy, it's not comparable to what's happening in Cuba, never during the sequence. The slave trade is also significantly less. So it's going to be easier for the Spanish authorities to kind of like agree to that Puerto Rico was going to be like, you know, is not going to introduce more slaves, or is going to participate of the abolitionist policy that the British are imposing. So the type of slavery is also different. You know, the importance of urban slavery and servitude is bigger than in Cuba, and also, for example, the attempts to replace that workforce with Chinese migrants and Yucatecos, so people coming from the peninsula of Yucatan in Mexico, it's going to appear earlier in Puerto Rico than in Cuba. They are going to look for alternatives sooner in Puerto Rico than in Cuba, which I think is very interesting. But in general, the position of the Spanish government is treating Puerto Rico as a not very important colonial space. Cuba is the priority. The diplomats are very much focused on what's happening there, and Puerto Rico is always like, you know, kind of like affected by the decisions that Cuba make. A lot of the Captain Generals, for example, go to learn the job at Puerto Rico first, and then they end up in Havana. But it's always like almost as a consequence of what's happening in Cuba, never as a policy that is dictated to apply directly to Puerto Rico. And the other third colonial space that no one really talks about, and I think is so important because it's going to give you a lot of clues of the Haitian Revolution particularly, is Santo Domingo, is the Spanish colony of Santo Domingo, which is, you know, it's an area that is absolutely ignored by the Spanish authorities. Like it gets to the point that there are moments, particularly in the context of the Haitian Revolution, that there isn't enough people, physically enough inhabitants in the colony to have a presence in the territory. So it's very interesting how when the revolutionary troops invade the Spanish side of the island, they didn't even notice at the beginning because there was no one at the border checking. So it's very much as a territory, a colonial space that is part of the picture, but that doesn't really play for the international politics of the time, and the Spanish diplomats don't really care that much about it. But yeah, we need to talk more. And I think that you know, yesterday that Julius Scott died, I think that this methodological approach of the common wind works so well for the Spanish Caribbean as well, for the Great Caribbean, not just for the islands, but for the mainland as well. And we need to really spend more time as historians of the Spanish Caribbean, as the Spanish context, looking at those territories. Because when the Americans started looking at places like Florida or New Orleans, they started producing the most fascinating histories. You know, when they stopped writing about New York and Boston, and they start writing about other places, that's when the good stuff happens. So I think that the equivalent for us is when we're going to start looking at other areas of the Caribbean. But I felt that for this history, I had to first tell the story of Cuba, because it's like kind of the backbone of this story. And then probably not just me, hopefully other people will start putting all the pieces together of other colonial spaces. And about anti-racism, 100%. Like my next project, the one that I'll be working in Cambridge, is called Black Soldiers of the Caribbean, and it's going to crucially talk about the role of certain generals and high-ranking officials in the Spanish army who are going to in a way promote anti-racist policies within the Spanish army by adopting Black soldiers and by promoting Black soldiers. Because I think that one very important path of self-emancipation and individual freedom was the access to the army, and once you got to the army, to access a position within the army that allowed you to be in charge of others. So that's kind of like the next project, the 1830s, in the context of this emergence of these very radical white supremacist positions, but also looking at the other side, what's happening with the anti-racist camp. I think that the connection between anti-racist and abolitionist is very challenging in Spain. I really struggle to see that. I know that some colleagues also reject it for the British context. They say that, it's very tricky to equate the both. But I think that for the Spanish context, it's even harder. So yeah, I'm in, and definitely I want to be part of that next project to try to map the history of the anti-racist discourses and movement in Spain, but also to write a history of white supremacist ideologies in Spain, because there is no, Spain, in many ways, this is like, I was talking to Erica the other day about the history of racism in Argentina. It's like, no, Argentina was never racist, no, because there were no Black people here. So it's a very similar position in Spain. No, Spain was not a racist country because there were no Black people here. Well, no, we need a history of racism in Spain.
Great. Well, that sounds like a fascinating new project, but also a good point to maybe end this session. Thank you so much, Jesus.
Sorry, Paulo, there is another question in the chat, if you don't mind.
Oh, sorry.
I'll reply super fast. Yeah.
I didn't see it. I can't see it, so if you can read it.
Yeah, so Alejandra is asking, did the 1868 revolution, the so-called Gloriosa revolution in Spain, change anything in the discourse about race and about slavery that can be distinct from the previous government? Yes, the 1868 is in the proclamation made by the revolutionaries, they include the abolition of the slave trade. So there is an element of, as part of the emergence of this radical politics, that is going to emphasize the importance of ending the slave trade as part of the revolutionary effort of 1868. But the reality is that the slave trade had already ended by the time of the revolution. So there wasn't much to end. Some sectors within the revolution also opposed slavery. But that is not going to be a mainstream position. The anti-slavery society, the Sociedad Abolicionista Española, is reinstituted because it had been illegalized for 3 years, is reestablished in 1968, and they are going to really try to press the new parliament to do something about it. But again, it's not going to be a mainstream position. It's not going to be kind of like at the forefront of their political position. Yes, the slave trade, but there was nothing left of that.
And do they link anything with the sort of revolution against the monarchy or becoming a republic? Is any Republican or hint of a Republican discourse on that?
Oh yeah. So the emergence of Republican discourses in the mid of the 1860s is fundamental. I don't think Gregorio knows a lot more than I do about this. I don't think that Republican discourses are huge in the 1860s. I don't think that there is, it's also not part of perhaps the mainstream of the revolutionaries of 68, but he'll be able, yeah, okay, so yeah, shut up. Gregorio, what do you have?
No, it's a relatively understudied area, and there are Republican movements since the last decade of the 18th century. You have figures such as Juan P. Corneille, who could then participate in La Guaira rebellion in New Granada. It's a very much understudied. Normally, historians working on this say it is in the liberal triennium when the first two Republican fields were experienced and well, very much linked to secret societies and so on. But yeah, I mean, as I said, an organized mass movement, it is in the early 1860s that they appeared, and very, very much divided in between Federalist and Unionist, and that would be, yeah, mostly the origins of the movement.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks to everyone for joining us, and particularly thanks to Gregorio and Jesús for such a great session. We're going to take a break now, but we'll be back in the new year with a series of new seminars, so I hope you can all join us then. But please join me in thanking Jesús for his talk and for the book, which I encourage you all to purchase.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. Take care.